Welcome once again, this time as we consider the Catholic Church in the era of the Civil War. Just about everyone who's ever read an American history textbook knows that the Civil War began with the bombardment of Fort Sumter in the very beautiful harbor of Charleston, South Carolina in 1861. It concluded 4 years later in April of 1865 when General Lee surrendered his forces to General Grant at Wilbur McLean's farmhouse in Appomattox, Virginia. Within those 4 years, we had a very, very serious conflict. Now, the period leading up to the Civil War, 1848 to 1861, is usually referred to by historians as the coming of the Civil War. For our purposes here, we're simply going to take all of this period of time from 1848 to the conclusion of the Civil War in 1861 and look at the Catholic Church during those years. If you lived in the North in those days, you pretty much would have adhered to the organic theory of government, whether you knew it or not. The organic theory of government simply held that years earlier, 13 individual colonies, or states, if you want to call them that, came together and they created what was to be a strong central government to rule the country. And it was the strong central government that was going to always take priority. Now, if you lived in the southern part of the United States, you probably were going to be a believer in the compact theory of government. The compact theory of government said these same states came together and they gave to a federal government the powers that they specifically wanted to give to the government, and they retained others, but it was the individual states that were important. So therefore, if an individual state wanted to protest, she could protest. And ultimately, this idea of states' rights, which comes to us from the compact theory of government, if it is taken to another degree, it becomes state sovereignty. And the belief was held that a state could very validly and very legitimately leave the Union if what the federal government, if what the Union was doing was unconstitutional. So they were the two theories of government, if you will, that divided the country north and south and had for many years. They were the theory. But what was it that people were actually, within the context of this theory, fighting over as we approached the Civil War and through the Civil War? We all know so well what they were fighting over. It is what American historian Kenneth Stamp has described as the peculiar institution, namely the institution of slavery. So for our purposes now, we want to begin by asking and attempting to answer the question, what was the United States Catholic position on slavery? Remember, in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, slavery was an accepted social institution in the United States. We were one of the last places in the civilized world who still hung on to this system which held human beings in bondage. Yet in truth, in the mid-19th century, Americans still socially accepted the institution and for the most part looked rather benignly on it. It was people like the abolitionists who wanted to do away with it who were considered very, very fanatical. Now, Catholics fell into this general pattern of accepting the social institution of slavery and not wanting necessarily to overturn it. That is not to say that the Catholic Church had never spoken out against this system which held people in bondage. The Church did speak out against it, and on many different occasions. Throughout the centuries, a significant number of popes spoke out very clearly against the institution of slavery as it existed in different parts of the world and under different circumstances. Now, if that is true, we then have to say, well, if the various popes had spoken out against it, why did the Catholic bishops in the United States not vocally speak out against slavery in these years? It may have been that because we were living in an era of vast distances, poor communication, lengthy transportation, and lack of good knowledge of other times and circumstances, many of the papal pronouncements did not strike the bishops, and for that matter, the Catholic laity, with the force with which papal pronouncements strike us today. It may also have been that by becoming too vocal, the bishops felt that they would once again stir up that anti-Catholic hostility that we were talking about in the last episode. It may also have been a complete inability on the part of the bishops to join forces with the abolitionists. And we'll tell you why they would not want to work with the abolitionists in just a few moments. It may have been racial prejudice on their part. It may have been a fear of looking like social revolutionaries. It probably was all of these factors. But the fact of the matter is, we do not hear pronouncements on the part of our American Catholic bishops. We do, however, hear a strong condemnation against the slave trade, the buying and selling of slaves, as being very immoral and very, very sinful. We also find a strong emphasis placed by the Catholic bishops on the moral obligations and duties of slave owners to instruct their slaves in the Roman Catholic faith and to see to it that the blacks living on their plantations, the slaves, receive the rudiments of Catholic teaching all through their life. Individual Catholics, a very different story. Archbishop John Carroll, for example, in 1815 recorded in his will that upon my death, my black slave Charles is to be manumitted, and Charles was manumitted. Charles Carroll of Carrollton owned many slaves, and he freed them all long before he died. Roger B. Taney, who had been Andrew Jackson's Attorney General and became the first Roman Catholic in the United States to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Roger Taney from the town of Frederick, Maryland, who handed down the Dred Scott decision, saying that purely and simply because Dred Scott lived in free territory, it did not make him a free man. Judge Taney, who was hung in effigy for being pro-slavery, nonetheless did, on a personal basis, manumit the slaves that he owned in Frederick, Maryland. Hence, we have a different sort of a picture when we look at individual Catholics. We also have to remember that the Catholic position, while it did not go nearly as far in its condemnation of slavery as the abolitionists, had a reason for not going as far. The abolitionists decried this system which held human beings in bondage. Very rightly so. But the abolitionists decried any system that held human beings in bondage, including the Roman Catholic Church. And with very few exceptions, the abolitionists were as anti-Catholic as they were anti-slavery. That is why the bishops did not want to join forces with them. That's why it would have been very difficult for individual Catholic people to take as strong a position, it would seem, as the abolitionists did. So the Catholic hierarchy were very fearful of upsetting the apple cart. Archbishop Francis P. Kenrick on one occasion wrote this, quotes, "Since this is the existing state of things, nothing should be attempted against the laws, or anything be done or said that would make them bear their yoke unwillingly." Now, he's talking about black slaves, but the reason he said that was we don't want to join forces with these abolitionists because as soon as slavery is abolished, their next target will be the Catholic Church. Therefore, thought Kenrick, we better leave well enough alone. There are interesting Catholic stories, of course, during these years. One involves an Irish immigrant by the name of Michael M. Healy. Healy had acquired a Georgia plantation of over 1,600 acres, and he owned approximately 17 slaves. One of the black slave girls became his wife and the mother of his 10 children. And of those 10 children, 5 became Roman Catholic priests. One was James Augustine Healy, who became the Bishop of Portland, Maine. The others were, 3 of them were Jesuits, and one of those 3 Jesuits became president of Georgetown University. If you would ever really want to know the Catholic differences between North and South, one of the best places to find the answer would be a series of letters, a series of correspondence that took place between John Hughes, who was the Archbishop of New York, and Patrick Neason Lynch, who was the Bishop of Charleston, South Carolina. Hughes represented the compact theory, or rather the organic theory of government par excellence. Lynch represented the compact theory of government par excellence. And these two men exchanged letters back and forth in their diocesan newspapers. Both of them had been born in Ireland. Both of them had undergone missions for their respective governments. Archbishop Hughes went to France for President Lincoln to try to ensure French neutrality during the Civil War. Bishop Lynch went to the Vatican on the part of President Jefferson Davis to try to ensure Vatican help, if you will, or Vatican recognition, I should say, for the legitimacy of the Confederate States of America. Of the two, Archbishop Hughes probably had more success because he did get French neutrality. Bishop Lynch was not able to get an official Vatican recognition for the Confederate States of America. Nonetheless, these two men conducted, as I say, this series of letters, and they expressed their theories of government. And the New York Herald commented very interestingly on the Hughes-Lynch correspondence. They referred to it as, quotes, statesmanlike views and admirable temper of correspondence, which should receive a widespread and attentive consideration both here and abroad. What about the Catholic press? Generally speaking, if you were a Catholic editor in the North, you would have favored the northern position. And generally speaking, if you were a Catholic editor in the South, you took the Confederate or Southern position. That is, if you were a Catholic editor in the North, you advanced the organic theory of government, you were pro-union. If you were a Catholic editor in the South, you advanced the compact or states' rights theory of government, and you were pro the Confederate States. One thinks, for example, of people like Father Edward Purcell, who was editor of the Cincinnati Catholic Telegraph for many years. Or another gentleman was Patrick Donahue, who was for many years the editor of the Boston Pilot. Now, there were some rather significant exceptions to these rules in the Catholic press, and one interesting exception came in the person of James Alphonsus McMaster. James Alphonsus McMaster was a convert to the Roman Catholic faith, and he was for a good number of years the editor of the Freeman's Journal in New York. At one particular period of time, the Freeman's Journal had been the official organ of the Archbishop of New York. James McMaster belonged to a political faction which we will refer to as the Copperheads. The Copperheads were people who lived in the North, but who took a Southern point of view, a states' rights point of view. They were very anti-Lincoln, very anti his administration, very anti the cause of the Union Army and the whole idea of the organic theory of government. Listen to one editorial now that James Alphonsus McMaster wrote in the pages of the Freeman's Journal. Quotes, "Let those heed it who 1 year ago scoffed when we said that the election of Lincoln would cause civil war. We say now that if there be not conservatism enough in the country to stop and to rebuke the course of Lincoln and his cabinet, we will have a bloody revolution and anarchy resulting in military despotism, with a very different man from Lincoln at its head. We speak what we see and what we know. Our consciences force us to speak, whether it please or whether it offend." Close quotes. It's not hard to see, writing things of that sort, why Mr. McMaster was imprisoned for a while here in the North during the Civil War. He had his newspaper suspended, and it was only after a couple of months behind bars that James A. McMaster was able to see the light of day again, and did, of course, have to cease and desist his editorial writing. Another interesting story, besides McMaster, involved Archbishop Francis Patrick Kenrick in the city of Baltimore. There had been a tradition in the Baltimore Cathedral, and by the 1860s, it was a tradition that had gone on for decades. It had gone on actually since the time of John Carroll, the first bishop of Baltimore. John Carroll had written a prayer for the preservation of the Union, for the President of the United States and all civil authorities, that they be preserved, but also that the Union had been preserved. And that prayer was read for decades after the Masses in the Baltimore Cathedral. Many of us certainly remember a period in history when we had those very beautiful prayers after Low Mass, the prayers for the conversion of Russia, prayer to St. Michael the Archangel, and so forth. Well, after they were said, Archbishop Carroll's prayer for the preservation of the Union was said. So we got now into the Civil War, and Archbishop Kenrick said to his priests and the cathedral household that, of course, we were going to continue saying the prayer for the preservation of the Union. Every priest in the cathedral household in Baltimore refused to say the prayer. Baltimore, of course, was a city of very divided allegiances during the Civil War. So the Archbishop said, well, if you all refuse it, I'll simply say the prayer myself at the conclusion of Mass. He did, he attempted it, and this is what he writes. Many people got up and publicly left the cathedral, while those who remained expressed dissent by a great rustling of papers and silks. So you see, they were interesting times, to say the very, very least. But one of the most significant things is this. During the Civil War, if you look at groups like the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Episcopalians, almost every Christian denomination split. The churches split north versus south, Northern Baptists versus Southern Baptists, Northern Methodists versus Southern Methodists, and the like. And those splits continued for decades after the Civil War. Those churches were divided. At absolutely no time during the course of the Civil War was there even the slightest hint that the Catholic Church, the all-inclusive body of Christ, could ever possibly be split north versus south. Catholics may have differed and differed very sharply on their political opinions, but when it came to the actual faith which they professed, they always professed it in unison. Catholics distinguished themselves in many ways during the Civil War. They distinguished themselves in the military, in the chaplaincies, and also on the battlefield. First of all, in the military, we have to look at a few well-known people. William Stark Rosecrans was a professor of military history at West Point when he converted and became a Roman Catholic. His younger brother, Sylvester Rosecrans, was so impressed with what his older brother did that he became a Catholic. And then he became a priest. And then he became the Bishop of Columbus, Ohio. General Rosecrans left the military, or William Rosecrans, I should say, left the military to begin a career as a businessman, an architect, and an engineer, and even a teacher. But when the Civil War began, he re-enlisted, rose to the rank of general, and we remember General Rosecrans for many, many famous battles during the Civil War. After the war's end, he served as our ambassador to Mexico, served as a congressman from California as well. Thomas Francis Meagher was another interesting character. He'd been born in Ireland and educated in the Jesuit College of Kildare. He became a very strong advocate for Irish independence, so much so that he was deported to Australia and finally found his way here to the United States. One time in the Music Hall in Boston, General Meagher gave a very strong speech in which he said this: "A national flag is one of the most sacred things that people can possess. It is the symbol of national authority. Oh, that never, never again may that flag meet with another disaster. Henceforth, the troops carrying it in action should have this motto to guide them: death if you will, victory if God grants it, but no defeat and no retreat." This colorful fellow went on to become governor of the Montana Territory after the Civil War. Little Phil was another one, Philip Henry Sheridan, a very popular cavalry leader of whom General Grant once said he had no superior as a general, either living or dead, and perhaps not even an equal. In the South, you had Pierre Gustave de Beauregard, a famous Roman Catholic. You had a very famous naval hero, Captain Raphael Semmes, who came from an old and distinguished Southern Maryland family. Even Jefferson Davis, who was not known for his love of Catholics, had two of them in his cabinet. He had John Reagan as his Postmaster General, and he had Stephen Russell Mallory as his Secretary of the Navy. Did you know when Jefferson Davis was a young congressman from Mississippi, he was sitting in the chamber, the House chamber, and Father Theobald Matthew, the great apostle of temperance, came in. He was only the second foreigner to ever address a joint session of Congress. Lafayette had been the first, and Father Matthew was the second. And Jefferson Davis, this young congressman, got up in protest and walked out of the House chamber purely and simply because a Roman Catholic priest had been invited to address a joint session of Congress. How different then Jefferson Davis was as president of the Confederacy when he had two Roman Catholics in his cabinet. We distinguished ourselves in the chaplaincies. Certainly we'd have to remember Father Abram Ryan, that poet of the Confederacy, a very, very intellectual sort of man who wrote poetry for many years before he entered the military and who distinguished himself not only for his service as a chaplain, but also for his very intellectual insights in the very beautiful poetry that he wrote. Father Francis Leray, very devoted to the Confederate cause, would go on to become a future Archbishop of New Orleans, Louisiana. There's a very famous depiction of a Holy Cross Father from the University of Notre Dame, Father Corby, a picture of him mounting a horse and riding through the battle lines during the famous Battle of Antietam and shouting to all the soldiers to be sorry for their sins because he was going to grant them general absolution on the battlefield in case they did not survive that terrible struggle at Antietam. Or you had the case of another Holy Cross priest from Notre Dame, Father Gillen. Father Gillen was unassigned and he had no orders, and he simply decided he was going to follow the troops around and minister to their spiritual needs wherever he found them. And one time General Grant came across Father Gillen and he said, "You know, you have no specific orders. I might have to arrest you." And Father Gillen said, "Oh no, please don't arrest me." And of course Grant did not arrest him, but he did give him formal orders, and Father Gillen continued to minister to the troops. Father James Sheeran, another very interesting man. Father James Sheeran was a Confederate chaplain. He was a member of the Redemptorist order, and he was not a man to keep his views on this conflict very quiet. Father Sheeran wrote in a newspaper article that the war was started by New England fanatics. He was speaking, of course, about the abolitionists. And he said that these New England fanatics wanted to undermine the cause of the South. The consequence, said Father Sheeran, was a war which was unjust and cruel and barbarous and inhuman. Sheeran was constantly doing things to try to help the morale of the Confederate troops. And he was a very, very severe man. It was nothing for him, for example, to get up on Sunday morning at Mass and preach for not one, not two, but 3 hours. Imagine preaching for 3 hours. Today you hear complaints if it goes more than 10 minutes. Father Sheeran preached to the troops for 3 hours. What did he preach about? He preached about the evils of gambling. He preached about the evils of drink. He preached about the evils of cursing and swearing and the like. And it was not at all uncommon if Father Sheeran was going on horseback and he heard a little foul language from some of the boys, or he saw a little bit of imbibing in between the battle scenes. It was not at all uncommon for Father Sheeran to stop and to get off the horse and to tell those fellas in no uncertain terms that what they were doing was very, very contrary to what he was preaching about on Sunday morning. He was, in point of fact, a very wonderful man. So Catholics distinguished themselves in the military, they distinguished themselves in the chaplaincies, and they distinguished themselves certainly on the battlefields. When we talk about the Catholic contributions on the battlefield, we go to the nation's capital in Washington, and in the nation's capital you will find a very beautiful monument which is entitled Nuns of the Battlefield. It is a recognition of the work of so many orders of religious sisters during the course of the Civil War. You could mention loads of religious communities of women who contributed very substantially during the Civil War, but we would want to single out, certainly, the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. The Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul deserve special recognition because from this one community, 231 sisters volunteered for service on the battlefield, not only at the Battle of Gettysburg, especially at Gettysburg, but also in a number of other conflicts as well. Also, if they were not serving on the battlefield, many of them served in what was known as the Ambulance Corps. Now, the people working in the Ambulance Corps would be those who would follow the troops in battle and go around to them. What's extremely important about the work of the religious sisters during the Civil War was not so much that they were out there working in a nursing capacity. After all, there were lots of nurses, there were lots of people helping. But rather, these sisters brought many fallen away Catholic soldiers back to the practice of the faith. They affected many, many non-Catholic soldiers in such a way that they were brought to the fullness of faith, which we know is Roman Catholicism. So they brought back many fallen aways. They attracted many who may not have been of the household of the faith to begin with, to come to that fullness of faith. And I suppose more than anything else, whether they brought back fallen aways, whether they attracted new converts, they did a tremendous amount to break down hostility. An awful lot of the soldiers, an awful lot of the generals who observed what these magnificent women were doing on the battlefield were not necessarily going to become Catholics themselves. Many of them did not. But they were tremendously impressed themselves. It broke down bigotry. It broke down the barriers that were created in a lot of the minds of these people who thought that Catholics were all bad. Catholics were not all bad. Look what these wonderful sisters were doing. President Abraham Lincoln had an interesting comment about the sisters. He said, quotes, "Of all forms of charity and benevolence seen in the crowded wards of the hospitals, those of some of the Catholic sisters were among the most efficient." Such then, my dear friends, as quickly as we can tell it, are the Catholic contributions during the era of the Civil War. In the military, in the chaplaincies, on the battlefields, Catholic contributions to the Northern cause, Catholic contributions to the Southern cause. Think of the force that the Roman Catholic Church had become in the United States. Think of the vibrancy of it. Think of how much we had grown and developed, the force we now were. People knew we were here. people knew we were going to stay. And as we begin reconstructing the nation, while we begin with some rather somber notes, we have some very optimistic stories to tell you in the period of Reconstruction as well. And we hope to see you for our next episode. Thank you.